What's being called the 12-Day War by Donald Trump, a brief but explosive conflict between Israel and Iran, ended with nothing more than civilian deaths and the continued genocide in Gaza. It began with unprovoked Israeli strikes on Iran, and of course, Iran responded. Then the US joined in, bombing Iran's nuclear sites with bunker buster missiles. Days later, a ceasefire was declared. Each country claimed victory, but nothing really changed. Today we're joined by Dr. Assal Rad, scholar of Middle East history and non-resident fellow at Dawn. Her work focuses on U.S. foreign policy, Iran, and Israel and Palestine. And she's here to help us break down what really happened, why it matters, and what comes next. Thanks for listening. This is the Mondawise Podcast. So it's been a whirlwind of the last 2 weeks. Israel launched strikes on Iran. Iran fired back. Then the U.S. jumped in, sending bombers to hit Iranian nuclear sites. Trump then declared a ceasefire on Truth Social, and now somehow, all three sides are claiming victory, even though more than 600 Iranians were killed by Israeli strikes. And during that same period of war that the U.S. and Israel had on Iran, Israel killed almost close to 900 Palestinians in Gaza, where media attention totally shifted its focus to Iran. Can you just explain, what actually happened in the last 2 weeks, and what is your initial reaction to this theater of war?
What we've seen from Israel, and especially the Netanyahu government, is one that is hell-bent on destruction in the region, plainly so, especially because every time it seems like he's facing some kind of domestic challenge, he starts a war somewhere. And this distracts domestically from the fact that he has his own legal and political issues. And more importantly, it takes attention away from the central issue in the region, and that is the genocide in Gaza. The fact that during this 2-week period, there was very, very little coverage in a sort of media ecosystem that already has poor coverage and under coverage to begin with. We saw that completely decline because the focus, and in some ways I understand, of course, there was another, there was the potential for a huge conflagration in the region, not just isolated to Israel and Iran. The fact that the U.S. entered the fray, all of this, in many ways, I think sent shockwaves throughout the world in the fear of what was going to happen. The sort of, is it World War III kind of thinking. And so I understand that, but at the same time, these events are not distinct from one another. They are interrelated because there's one central culprit, and that is Israel. And that seems to be the part of the story that is missing. And the way that the media sort of framed these last 12 days has been ridiculous, where Israel was clearly the aggressor, attacked Iran, killed civilians, bombed its civilian infrastructure, and somehow Iran's retaliation was condemned by European parties and in the West, but Israel's actions were painted as self-defense. And the media used this language of preemptive strikes, which we probably all remember from 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, in order to justify what was an attack. There was no imminent threat from Iran. Iran was not going to attack Israel. Iran does not have nuclear weapons, which I think is clear now. Yet there was an attempt to justify it. So I don't know. There's a lot to sort of discuss in there, but I think there has to be a narrative that understands that there is one central state that is causing constant destruction and instability in the region, and that is Israel. And the other states in the region, in this case, while Iran is sort of depicted in the West as this irrational, zealous, theocratic state, they're the ones who acted the most rationally. They're the ones who defended themselves and made sure to target only Israel rather than creating a larger conflict within the region. And when the U.S. responded to them, also responded with, yet again, a measured, calibrated response to prevent further escalation.
Can you dive more into some of the stuff that you are always tweeting about? And you were talking about, I think one of your tweets about the New York Times headlines. And I was wondering, if you could just talk about, this kind of violence in a way of how the media frames things and dehumanizes Palestinians, Iranian civilians over the course of the last 2 weeks, and how that plays into this like bigger perception that people have of people in the Middle East, America's perception on Israel, which seems like that's slowly fading from recent polling. Yeah, if you could just talk about Western media.
So if Western media reflects the Western narrative, it's what the official, if the official state position is that we have unconditional support for Israel, Western media follows suit. It's actually, in many ways, we've seen Western media manufacture consent for the war in Iraq based on lies. We've seen them manufacture consent for the Gaza genocide. And we saw them attempt this sort of manufacturing of consent for an attack on Iran. And how they do it is through the use of language. So I mentioned, for instance, at the very beginning of Israel's attack on Iran, the way that it was described was preemptive strikes. There's certain language that's used: preemptive strikes and targeted. And this makes it sound like, A, Israel was being threatened, and so they're trying to justify the strikes. And also that Israel's strikes are targeted, and so they're sort of ignoring the fact that civilians are being killed. That when Israel calls a targeted strike an assassination of an Iranian scientist, which is, by the way, in and of itself illegal, like scientists are not military targets, but that is, that's put aside. But even when they're carrying out these sort of targeted assassinations, there are entire apartment buildings that collapsed that have civilians in them. These scientists or other officials, whether they are military targets, or have families that were in the houses with them. So you're killing civilians as well, but that's not the language that's used. Iranian civilians are not really part of the story, much like what the language that we see, it's parallel to the language that we see when it comes to Gaza. Constantly when a hospital is hit, when a school is hit, when 100 civilians are killed in one sort of bombing or massacre, you see the Western media use language like Israel hits hospital, says it was targeting Hamas, says it was targeting Hamas leader. And that allows them to justify it. Whereas in reverse, that is not the language that is used. For instance, when an Israeli hospital was hit by an Iranian missile, there was nothing that said they were targeting something. But, if we're going to say that is a war crime, then Israel has committed that war crime over and over again on a daily basis for us all to see. But it's never treated that way. So it's the fact that there's a double standard in not only the language, but even the act itself. You see language like Iran threatens, Israel warns. Israel warns Iranians that they have to evacuate and leave. Iran threatens to attack things. So small changes, differences in the language that's used. In this last, right before the ceasefire was basically went into effect, you saw a headline in the New York Times that said something, I forgot the exact wording, but it said something to the effect of, Iran carries out deadly attack on Israel before ceasefire takes effect. This went against what President Trump himself said. I mean, in his very colorful language that he used yesterday when he was angry, while he said that both parties violated it, his anger was really targeted at Israel. And the point that he made was within the first hour that he had announced the ceasefire, Israel basically dropped what he called, he said they dropped the most bombs that he had ever seen, the likes of which he had never seen. This is the way that Donald Trump described Israel's attacks on Iran. And he was very angry about it. And that's because they were, using this last moment of belligerence. When Iran responded again to those attacks, that's what you see in the New York Times headline, as if Israel had not carried out massive attacks on Tehran after Trump had announced the ceasefire. So there's this constant sort of language that if you really want to go to the core of it, this is what it essentially becomes. Iran is the embodiment of evil, and everything they do is wrong, no matter what they do. So even when Iran acts in self-defense, they are the ones that are condemned. Even when Iran is attacked, they're the ones that are at fault for being attacked. So they're always the bad guy. Israel is the embodiment of good. And therefore, even when Israel commits genocide, it is justified. So there's this warped reality in which this kind of language and policy exists in, But the job of the media, in theory, in a free press, is to challenge the narratives of the state. Instead, they absolutely parrot it, and in doing so, try to create this kind of public discourse that justifies Israel's actions. The reason why we have seen a shift in public opinion is because of the footage that people are seeing every single day. And it's the independent media sources, Palestinian journalists on the ground. Those are the sources that are actually giving us the real story, whereas legacy media is basically a propaganda machine.
I want to back up a little bit. So before Israel attacked Iran, Iran and the U.S. were in the middle of a deal. At least in negotiations, talks for around nuclear program, and then Israel, no pun intended, blew up that deal. It seems like. Do you think talks are in the future for these two parties to come back to each other? And at the same time, though, before you answer that question, backing up again, and you mentioned this earlier, Netanyahu was like politically on the ropes. Do you think a deal between the U.S. and Iran is ever going to happen, or diplomacy is going to, back on the table between these two countries? And then do you think Netanyahu started this with Iran to blow up that deal specifically and to just shift attention away from Gaza?
Well, so there's a lot to unpack there. In terms of Netanyahu sabotaging the deal, that's what Netanyahu does. He does not want diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran, and that was the case when it was the Obama administration, and it was the case when it was the Trump administration, and it's the case again now. He simply does not want there to be any kind of peaceful relations between these two states, because what Netanyahu has tried to do since the 1990s is use Iran as this boogeyman that he can always point to talk about a sort of existential crisis that Israel faces. The reality of it is, Iran doesn't pose an existential threat to Israel. It poses a threat to Israel's hegemony in the region. And the idea that if Iran's nuclear program, for instance, were to be resolved diplomatically and there were to be calm relations between the US and Iran, that kind of language wouldn't necessarily resonate in the same way, and he wouldn't be able to use that rhetoric in the US. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. During the Biden administration, when there were questions about US arms shipments to Israel based on US domestic law, because Israel was clearly carrying out gross violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and committing war crimes, when the question would arise, and Biden officials tried to sort of play this pretend game like they did care about international law, even though they were helping shred it the entire time. But in their pretend game, when the question would arise, they would say, well, Israel faces other threats. So the reason we're shipping these arms is not to do with Gaza. It has to do with these other threats that they have. And that would always be Iran. So there is that boogeyman that is always there to justify Israel's actions. And if you get rid of that, it changes the way that they can use that kind of language and that kind of discourse. So yes, he's constantly sabotaging any form of diplomacy. I mean, the US and Iran were set to have talks on Sunday. Netanyahu attacked 2 days before they were set to have their next round of talks. Is there still room for diplomacy? That's another question. We're seeing those signals on the US side. So President Trump is saying that he still wants to have negotiations with Iran and he wants to settle the nuclear issue through negotiations. This is after the US carried out an attack on Iran, and Iran responded really symbolically in order not to escalate the conflict and the confrontation with the US. On the Iranian side, is there room for diplomacy? There may be. The Iranians might see that that's really the only way out of this situation still. Their calculation might be different, though. And the sort of irony is that Israel's actions, Iran has made a political choice not to have a nuclear weapon. It's not that they don't have the knowledge. It's that they have chosen not to weaponize the program. That calculus might change when you're constantly under attack. If you look at the Libya model versus the North Korea model, it's a very simple calculation that says, well, if you had a nuclear weapon, you wouldn't be under attack right now. And it'll be sort of a historic irony if the state that constantly talked about Iran as being a nuclear threat sabotaged every path to diplomacy that would have prevented Iran from having a nuclear weapon because it would have limited Iran's nuclear program, is actually the party that sort of forced them into having a nuclear weapon because they saw that as their only means of deterrence or defense. Because within the world of diplomacy, they've been punished over and over again.
Yeah. You talked about too how Iran's response. I mean, we've seen it. It was very calculated and very controlled. But what I thought was interesting too is that this whole like axis of resistance didn't seem to show up for Iran, or they didn't call on them. We didn't see increased activity from the Houthis or from Hezbollah or what's left of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Do you have any thoughts on that or reasons for why that was?
Well, certainly there's the fact that these groups, especially Hezbollah and Hamas, have been degraded, but it's also because the depiction of the axis of resistance and Iran's sort of control over all of these parties has always been exaggerated for political purposes. That's why you see things when the Houthis are carrying out attacks in the Red Sea. You see Western media pick up things like Iran-backed rebels or Iran-backed Houthi group or Iran-backed proxies. This is constantly used because, again, within the political discourse that tries to constantly paint Iran as the culprit of everything and Israel is always the sort of victim in everything without any kind of, no matter what is happening on the ground, this plays into that narrative. In reality, Iran does not have, these groups have their own agency, they have their own interests. And on top of that, Iran didn't, when there was, as things were happening in Lebanon, for instance, when Israel invaded Lebanon, it's not like Iran joined the fray. So again, all of these actors are acting in certain ways in their own interest and in part because they're trying to de-escalate and contain the conflict, whereas Israel is trying to expand the conflict constantly. It's not by coincidence that they've bombed 5 countries in the region in the last 2 years. So while Israel is trying to create conflict, the rest of the region is trying to contain it because they understand that it's to no one's benefit except Israel. Iran has made strides in the last 2 or 3 years to build better relationships with its neighbors, especially states like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and other Arab Gulf states. And so, they don't want to immediately burn those bridges by creating a situation where the sort of economic stability and vision projects of those countries are challenged if there is instability in the region. In that sense, I think there is a reason why they're not all just joining in together when there's something going on. On top of all of that is, the question of, them having been degraded to some extent. But I don't think Iran wanted, if, for instance, if militias in Iraq started to attack U.S. personnel or assets, then that would be an attack on the U.S. and that would bring the U.S. into the war in a different way. And so I think they're trying to, in many ways, avoid that.
Throughout all this, Israel's genocide in Gaza, didn't stop. In your view, how is Gaza connected to Israel's war on Iran, either strategically, ideologically, or symbolically?
Well, Israel is an expansionist state. I don't think there's any question to that. Even its attempts to annex the West Bank or take territory in Gaza, even just if you look at Palestinian territory, it's an expansionist state because it's constantly trying to take more land that does not belong to Israel under international law. It's this idea that you can take land through conquest, which is supposed to be against international law, but Israel doesn't feel this way. They also occupy Syrian territory. They also currently occupy and historically have occupied on a number of occasions Lebanese territory. So there's an expansionist nature to the state. It's also obviously focused most importantly on Palestinians because it is Palestinians that they occupy and have occupied for decades. So the way that it's all connected is because these wars are ways of continuing this sort of endless conflict. I mean, there's 2 aspects to it. There's Netanyahu himself as an individual figure who does face theoretically challenges at home, like I said, legal and political challenges. And so there's his attempts to stay in power and for his coalition to survive. But then there's the Israeli state. Sometimes this is painted as Netanyahu's war. And that is inaccurate because It's been Israel's occupation for decades, not Netanyahu's. It is an Israeli position to annex the West Bank and take Palestinian territories. The apartheid system that defines the Israeli state and the way that Palestinians are treated is Israeli state policy. Settler expansion, pogroms in the West Bank that terrorize Palestinians are protected by the Israeli military. So it's the entire state that is behaving this way. But those two factors playing into each other, you can also see how someone like Netanyahu wants to sort of expand the theater of war as much as he possibly can, because as you said earlier, it helps for him. It helps to sort of galvanize nationalist responses oftentimes when countries are at war. And Iran has been this sort of peak enemy of Israel in the way that it's been depicted for Israeli society. So it's easier to sell that kind of confrontation or war to, I think, the Israeli public. And Netanyahu has really capitalized on this idea. All of that to say, nothing in the region will be resolved until Palestinians are free. It's a very simple thing. As long as the occupation exists, the root cause for instability in the region exists. And as long as there is a genocide going on in Gaza, all of these other confrontations and attacks that Israel carries out must be linked to that genocide, especially when it's distracting from the fact that there are daily atrocities still being carried out. When you delink them, Gaza becomes invisible as if that's not happening. But that was happening every single day. As Israel was killing Iranian civilians, they were also killing Palestinian civilians. They also bombed Lebanon. It's all interconnected because the culprit at the heart of it is one state.
Absolutely. What do you feel like was accomplished, if anything, by either party? I mean, Iran was able to, expose Israel's defenses and show that it's able to, bomb sites in Tel Aviv and Haifa. Of course, Israel thinks that it was able to stop a nuclear deal and destroy, facilities and show what it's capable of. And then the U.S. comes in, last minute bombing on a nuclear site to show that support to Israel. But in the end, there's a ceasefire. Everyone is claiming some kind of victory. What do you think has been accomplished?
Honestly, I would say nothing has been accomplished by anyone because I don't take the view that these, wars are beneficial to anyone. Innocent people were killed, infrastructure, people's homes damaged and broken on all sides. That doesn't, and I can't see how any of that is a victory. I mean, if you're looking at it, I guess you could say no one lost and no one won. Because everyone, to your point, can claim some kind of victory because that's why you got a ceasefire so quickly. I think from the Iranian side, some people may have been surprised to see that Iran was actually able to hit targets in Israel. Because in previous retaliations that Iran carried out against Israel after its embassy was attacked in Damascus and after Israel carried out an assassination of Hania in Tehran, essentially almost everything was intercepted. And the idea is that Iran, again, has shown repeatedly that it doesn't actually want to escalate. You can go back to 2020 and the assassination of Soleimani, the US assassination of General Soleimani. And if you look at the Iranian response, it was very similar to the response we saw just a few days ago against the US base in Qatar, right? So there's a attempt to have no casualties and very limited damage to show that they responded for their own domestic population, but at the same time not to escalate. When Iran was able to hit so many targets in Israel, I think people were surprised by their ability to do so and their ability to actually, defend against Israeli missiles as well. And I think that puts them in a different position. Also showed their willingness to defend, right? They're not just going to surrender despite the language that's being used by this administration and by Israel itself. That's not what happened. They weren't willing to surrender. The fact that their nuclear sites were hit with so much US power, and in reality, the damage that was done, not that it didn't set back the program, it certainly did, but it's limited. So it is another point that proves that the real resolution, the real path was always through diplomacy, militarily being able to destroy this program is very difficult because you also can't destroy their knowledge. They have knowledge of it, so they can always rebuild it. Israel, can claim victory in the fact that it killed or assassinated Iranian scientists and military officials. But Iran is a large state. It has a massive population. It has a massive bureaucracy. And so the idea that, you've sort of destroyed something by doing that, I think is a bit of a weak argument as well. The US was able to enter the war and then quickly pull back and engage in a ceasefire, or implement a ceasefire, which I also think is exemplary of U.S. power. Right? It also shows that Iran does not want to get into a larger confrontation. So there's all sorts of ways of reading it. I think the other aspect of it that I think is important is there was a sense from the language that Israeli officials were using about regime change that believed if Israel started to attack Iran, then the Iranian populace would rise up against the Islamic Republic because they have such very legitimate and deeply held grievances towards the state. That's not what we saw happen. In fact, I think the dominant sentiment was of people who simultaneously took issue with the Islamic Republic and don't support the Islamic Republic, but at the same time did not support Israel's attacks that were killing their neighbors and destroying people's homes. So in that sense, I don't know. I would say there's sort of no winners or losers. It's just a lot of destruction and needless death carried out by a genocidal state that continues to create instability and destruction in the region.
My next question was actually about that point about how it almost seemed like, early on in the war, Netanyahu was telling the Iranian people to rise up against their government, this regime change talk. And it kind of the opposite, like you said, it kind of unified the populace a little bit, just not around the government, but around this is our country. We don't want you guys to come in and destroy it. And, Israel was terrorizing everyone there, telling people in Tehran to evacuate. You see these car bombings, this similar attack that they did in Lebanon with the pagers. I mean, it must have been terrifying for your family there, your friends that you have there. My last question, were you surprised by the ceasefire announcement when you heard it? Were you did it make sense to you? Did it catch you off guard? I mean, for me, the whole last 12 days have been completely I don't know anything. So I was just curious, when you heard the ceasefire, how did you react initially?
President Trump is a uniquely unpredictable political figure. He doesn't adhere to a specific ideology. I mean, there was, it was interesting to see the reactions of, again, in the US about, oh, well, if, these single issue voters who allowed him to become president, and by single issue, they mean genocide. These are the consequences of being single issue voters. And yet the attack that was carried out by the US, this whole thing had already been practiced essentially a year ago under the Biden administration. So the idea that somehow if Kamala Harris had won the election, they would stop Israel from attacking Iran, even though they didn't stop Israel from attacking Lebanon in a very similar way, doesn't really hold at all. But when you look at the sort of, I guess, the response, what was the response within Iran, it's hard to call it unifying entirely, but at least you didn't get the kind of reaction that Netanyahu wanted. If you note, he used the exact same language in Lebanon. He also spoke to the Lebanese people and said, my war is not against you, even though he killed thousands of them. My war is not against you. It's against Hezbollah. You should rise up. And again, that's not the kind of messaging that I think works.
He also uses it with Palestinians in Gaza against Hamas.
Yeah, it does. It's just clearly this is not the messaging that works. And I think it's because the messaging isn't real. He's not really concerned with, Lebanese people or Palestinians or Iranians. The idea that a war criminal that is carrying out a genocide cares about the innocent lives anywhere is absurd to begin with. But when going back to the idea of, the ceasefire and the predictability of things, it's sort of a roller coaster. You're on a roller coaster. Was I entirely surprised? No, because I do think that Trump has shown time and time again. The problem is so he plays this idea of being anti-war. And to some extent he is. But then obviously the counter argument to that is, but he just entered a war with Iran. So how can he be anti-war? Because in his mind, he can carry out this kind of attack and then reel it back. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want a long confrontation, but he really plays on this idea of U.S. power, which is true. I mean, the U.S. is militarily superior. I mean, if you're comparing it to Iran, there's obviously absolutely no comparison. But was I surprised from the Iranian side that they would accept a ceasefire? No, not necessarily, because again, they have shown time and time again that they don't want a larger confrontation. Israel accepting it may have actually been the most surprising part to me. Now we have to see what Israel means by a ceasefire, because in the case of Lebanon, a ceasefire for Israel means we can fire on you whenever you want. You just can't respond in kind. Mm-hmm. I do not think that would be the case with Iran, though. I think they might be aware of the fact that if Israel does try to carry out another attack on Iran, Iran will respond in kind. They've already shown that that is what they will do. So in a way, was I surprised by the ceasefire? Yes and no. I think the worry was always, the potential fallout, how far this can go, depending on the steps that, the United States and Israel take, and Iran, of course, can create a much larger and prolonged war. So I was happy to see that there was a ceasefire, because anywhere where we can, stop bombing, countries can stop bombing each other and innocent civilians aren't being killed and infrastructure isn't being damaged is a good thing. And on top of that, the hope is that the focus shifts back to Gaza, where a ceasefire is desperately needed. And not just a ceasefire. We talk about a ceasefire in Gaza, but we need accountability for what Israel has done over the last 21 months. There has to be accountability for genocide. There has to be, we don't even know the real numbers. We don't even know what's actually going on in Gaza, because Israel will not allow foreign press in. They won't allow independent investigations by the UN to see what's really happening. So, you're always shocked but not surprised, I think, with this administration and what is happening.
Professor Assal, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your wisdom and your critical analysis. Always, I really enjoy speaking with you and just hearing your thoughts on things. And I'm going to link your Twitter in the show notes so people can follow you on there, where you are always sharp, and I really enjoy your tweets on there as well. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That's our show. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, please go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.